Okay. FDR breaks the three-term tradition by winning in the fall of 1940 re-election to a third term. He gets over 55% of the popular vote, and it's clear that the American people want to keep him in the presidency to guide us through this second great crisis, right? This looming war, World War II. After winning the election in 1941, FDR achieves a major concession from Congress. It's called the Lend-Lease Act, one of the most important bills of this period from the United States. In 1941, Congress passes this bill, and this is clearly now an effort to step away from the strict parameters of the Neutrality Acts. It's important to remember that, well, number one, a good thing does happen for England. The Battle of Britain with the fall of France, right, to keep control of British skies so that they wouldn't get invaded, is a win for England. So British pilots were flying around the clock for weeks to stop the German Air Force, and it had largely stymied the Luftwaffe, much to Hitler's frustration. So basically, the Nazis decided to pivot to a phase that the British will call the Blitz. Instead of essentially locking down control of British skies, the Nazis decide that they're just going to conduct a systemic period of bombing on the British people, and that's the Blitz. So from about September 1940 to May of 1941, the Blitz just saw German bombers coming in, usually at night, hundreds of them, and just attacking, cities in the southern part of England, ports, things like that. In the first night, over 28,000 citizens of London died. And this was a very real test for the British people and the test for Churchill's leadership as prime minister during this period, because the British Air Force just couldn't stop these bombings for quite some time. Basically, FDR convinces Congress that we're going to need to give more aid to England, who's alone right now, seeming to be the only thing stopping the Germans from expanding their aggression west of Europe to North America. And so the Lend-Lease Act is the first law to really kind of, again, shift away from the Neutrality Acts. One of the criticisms of the Lend-Lease Act was that it didn't really end cash and carry fully in its first iteration. So we'll talk more about that later. All right, so with the passage of the Lend-Lease Act in 1941, FDR tells the American people that if your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't just let it burn, right? You give them your garden hose and you hope you may get it back, but you don't expect it back. So that's what it means. You lend England the supplies it needs, ships, weapons, stuff like that. And if they can't pay now, we'll figure something out. The lease part was basically the British had allowed us to lease out British ports around the world, which should help American naval and economic interests right around the world, the British Empire. So it's kind of like take what you need now and you'll pay it back later in some other form. So it's kind of, again, Lend-Lease is leaving away the strict policy of cash and carry. What ends up happening, though, is that in 1941, with Lend-Lease, the British are assisted, right? Churchill is desperate for that. But also, Hitler decides to turn his attention away from England, right? And then focus basically on a huge invasion of the Soviet Union. And while that happens, we decide to extend Lend-Lease to the Soviets in the summer of 1941. By this point, because we've assisted England, and now we are also assisting the Soviet Union after the Germans attacked them, we start to become targets of German aggression. German submarines start sinking American ships. The Gulf of Mexico, so the port city of Houston, all the way to Mobile, Alabama, and around Florida, becomes one of the most dangerous shipping lanes in 1941. They're sinking German submarines, American oil tankers, and things like that. And there's a lot of chilling reports of German submarines sailing unopposed along the American coast because we're so ill prepared for the war by 1941. In April of 1941, Churchill asked for a secret meeting with FDR, and that's what you're seeing here. And the two men agree to a document that is known as the Atlantic Charter. This is a really big moment. It doesn't mean we're in the war, right? And there was a reason the meeting was secret, right? Because FDR didn't want the public to find out that he was meeting with Churchill, a guy who was at war. But It's a commitment. In the document, FDR agrees that if America were to get into a war, that we would be on the side of England, and our first priority would be to destroy Nazi tyranny. And when the public finds out about this, FDR gets a lot of criticism because this was seen as deceptive and manipulative. But it is important because once we get into the war, people would assume that we're all going to go after Japan, right? Because that's the country that got us in. And when you look at policy and strategy, it's not. Our first commitment, our first priority when we're at war is to defeat Nazi Germany. And that goes all the way back to this secret agreement in the spring of 41. Here's some photographs of the Blitz. The bombings were so consistent, so widespread, and so dangerous that you had Londoners in a city literally sleep at night in the subway tunnels, the tube as they're called in England, sometimes next to strangers. This is the aftermath of one of those nightly bombings. You can see the gutted out buildings. Luckily, the church is still standing, but widespread destruction. And this is going to instill in the British people a real thirst, in a way, for revenge, right, against Germany. So when you look at Allied strategy, bombardment of German cities, right, is going to be a big part of what we do once America is involved in the war in Europe. In the fall of 1940, you get officially what's known as the Axis powers, and you need to know this. These are going to be our enemies, right, in World War II. So Germany and Italy had already been sort of allies, right, as the two fascist powers of Europe. But by, again, September of 1940, Imperial Japan signs on. And this creates what we call the Axis powers, right, this alliance between Germany, Italy, and Japan. And here is some propaganda from Japan, right, celebrating the agreement known as the Tripartite Pact, the three-power pact, the Axis powers. Again, Japan, Italy, and Germany. Here's a young German in his Hitler Youth uniform. All right, so what actually happens in 1941? Well, despite the advice of his generals, again, Hitler demands a preparation and invasion of the Soviet Union. Just to give some scope to this, this is the largest ever invasion seen in military history on land. It's over 3 million German soldiers getting mobilized for this. The width of the Eastern Front, as it becomes known, is basically the width of the United States. You're talking about almost 3,000 miles. So this is staggering. And despite all the information that was coming to Stalin from his secret police and spies about this buildup and the impending invasion, Stalin really failed in this moment. He refused to believe that Hitler would break his word of the Non-Aggression Pact in 1939, and was, I think, scared to some degree of the success the Germans would likely have with an invasion. It still comes. So in the summer of 1941, late June, the Germans invade the Soviet Union, and Hitler believes this is a huge part of Lebensraum, right, living space. He's going to fill this land once they purge it of Jews and communists and Slavs. They believe the Russian people are inferior and really should have no sort of say in if they live or die, right, or if they even have any land to survive. This will be a big eastern part of the Third Reich. And so in the summer of 1941, the Germans cut through the Soviet Union like a hot knife. This is a real disastrous period for Stalin and the Soviet Union. And guys, this is all the activity of Germany up until this point. You have them annexing and taking land here. You have them taking the Rhineland in 1936. You have them conquering Poland in 1939. You have them invading, right, the Nordic countries in 1940, taking France that year, bombing England repeatedly through 1940 and 41, and then deciding to actually invade all the Soviet Union. If that wasn't enough, Italy was having trouble with Greece in 1941, so the Germans also sent units down into the Balkans, and so they conquered huge chunks of the Balkans all the way down to Crete in Greece. This is just photographs of the German campaigns in the Soviet Union. Again, suffering of civilians. A big part of the Nazis in the Soviet Union is that they're going to exact a horrific toll on the Russian people. Millions of Russians will be dead by the end of World War II. I think it's like 25 million. And there is a huge thirst of revenge. And as far as the Russians are concerned, the Russian people, they're fighting for their very survival. So when we talk about World War II, Russia paid a tremendous cost, not just in military and economic terms, but in human life. as a result of the fighting and the casualties. All right, how do we get into the war? So basically, Japan has been expanding, right? It's taken China. They have their eyes set on Southeast Asia. So we're talking about, Malaysia, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and so on. And in 1941, they start making moves. They want to take these areas, not just to expand their empire in the Pacific, but also to get needed resources. Rubber and oil are the two big ones. Turns out that America is the largest oil supplier to Imperial Japan. FDR decides that it's time to make it clear the Japanese, we do not support further aggression by them in the Pacific. And FDR pretty much puts them on an oil embargo. He says, we're not selling you any more oil, so it's just going to hurt your military, it's going to hurt your economy. And they freeze Japanese assets in American banks and businesses, things like that here in the United States. When that happens, the Japanese government decides to do a few things. Secretly, they start planning an attack on the United States. Publicly, they demand essentially negotiations to figure this out, right, to lift the oil embargo. But the whole time we're doing this, right, they're planning an attack. And by this point, the Japanese government is led by a man you should be aware of, no longer a civilian politician, right? He's a general, Hideki Tojo. He's the prime minister. And we knew from naval intelligence that they would likely try something to attack American forces in the Pacific, the belief being that it would be somewhere close to Japan. So the belief was probably the Philippine Islands, where we had some forces there. Turns out they stunned us and had a real good success by going way, far away from the Philippines and actually attacking really kind of the bulk of our naval strength in the Pacific, which was in Hawaii. So on December 7th, Sunday, December 7th, 1941, mid-morning, Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And this is really the event that brings us to war. This is a photograph from a Japanese pilot swooping in to conduct some bombing runs on the naval base at Pearl Harbor. This is a Japanese map from Naval Intelligence showing you kind of the insane level of preparedness and sort of bold decision to actually sail thousands of miles across the Pacific with big aircraft carriers to launch this aerial attack and bombardment, again, on Pearl Harbor, and then to be able to make it back to Japan. And again, huge success. This is a famous photograph of the bombardment. This 2-hour attack will sink 8 American battleships. This is the famous sort of destruction of the USS Arizona, a ship that FDR had commissioned when he was Secretary of War under Wilson. Over 2,000 American servicemen are dead, and 188 planes are lost, and over 1,000 civilians were injured in this 2-hour attack. And I would encourage you guys to go back and watch this video. This is FDR's moment in front of Congress requesting a declaration of war. Very somber moment. Millions of Americans were stunned to hear about the Japanese attack. They didn't know exact casualties for many years. The government kept that secret, but they did admit it was a devastating blow. The only saving grace was that the most important ships in the U.S. Pacific Fleet, the carriers, the aircraft carriers, were not actually in port the day of the attack. They were out doing training exercises. So the Navy has been wounded, right? The Japanese have the momentum on their side by the end of the attack on Pearl Harbor, but we have the means to kind of respond, right, with our aircraft carriers. Carriers are the big planes with the flat decks that carry all the fighter craft and bombers and things like that. And so the Navy is desperate to kind of come up with a strategy to prevent further attacks up in Alaska, American soil, and a possible attack on the American West Coast in California. And luckily, they'll be able to mount a comeback, right, and turn that momentum against the Japanese the following year. So please remember that on December 8th, 1941, FDR gets Congress to declare war on Imperial Japan, and by December 11th, Germany and Italy has declared war on the U.S., and likewise vice versa. The vote on the war took 4 hours in the Senate and had only one opposing vote in the House of Representatives. All right, so Pearl Harbor is the event that brings us into World War II.